Millionaire was told he's sterile, but his maid gave birth to twins, and a DNA test shocked everyone. Hello, my beautiful family. It's me again, Henry here. And today, I'm going to share with you a story written by Noah. He was once admired by the world until a single accident took his fiancée and his future as a father. She was just a maid with brown eyes and worn-out shoes, stepping quietly into his life like a passing breeze. No one could have predicted that she would be the one to awaken a heart that had turned to stone. Between sleepless nights, silent cups of tea, and lingering glances, a love quietly began to grow. But just when they dared to walk into the light, the sky collapsed. An arrest, a betrayal, a tearful goodbye. And one woman, with no power, no title, stood up and fought for the man she loved. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? Your support is the reason stories like this keep being told. Let's begin. At the very top of Blake Heights, where the wind barely reaches and sunlight is nothing more than a pale reflection against glass, lives Ethan Blake. It isn't just the executive office of a successful CEO. It's a fortress of solitude encasing a man who once had everything and then lost it all. Ethan Blake, 36, was once a visionary architect, the kind who turned concrete dreams into living, breathing structures across Chicago's skyline. But everything shattered 14 years ago in a single car crash. His fiancée, Claire, died on their way to their engagement party. Ethan survived, but the doctor said he'd never be able to father children again. From that day on, he no longer cared about light, structure, or beauty. He didn't just lose Claire, he lost the version of himself that believed life could be beautiful. He withdrew from the architectural world, rebranding himself as the cold, calculated CEO of Blake Enterprises, the very company he co-founded with his best friend, Darren Miles. He no longer built homes. He built towers, tall, sealed, and impossible to enter. Each morning, Ethan rose at 4:45 a.m., trained alone in his private gym, ate oatmeal and black coffee, then spent the rest of the day encased in his glass office. No music, no warm lighting, no conversation beyond reports and signatures. He was still handsome, still powerful, but his once bright blue eyes now held only silence. People called him the ghost of Blake Heights, a king without a crown, ruling an empire he no longer cared to touch. Though worth billions, Ethan hadn't appeared at a single gala, press event, or charity dinner in nearly a decade. Rumors about his private life were so abundant, no one knew what to believe anymore. Some said he lived with robots, others claimed he hadn't left the 88th floor in years. The truth was, Ethan didn't trust anyone. Not after Claire's death, not after the hopeless years of failed treatments. He had taught himself how to survive without feeling. He buried himself in work, in numbers, in the glass walls he had once drawn with his own hands, taller, thicker, colder. They couldn't betray him. They couldn't leave him. But what Ethan didn't know was that those walls were about to tremble, and the one who would crack them wasn't a business rival or financial threat. It was a small woman with brown eyes and worn-out shoes. The interview took place on a gloomy Monday morning, rain misting against the high-rise windows. The living room on the 88th floor glowed coldly beneath white light. Ethan sat back in his black leather chair, eyes fixed on the papers in his hand. For the first 5 minutes, he didn't even look at the woman sitting across from him. He just listened to her voice, gentle, calm, with a trace of wind from the southern plains of Mexico. "Full name?" he asked, eyes still on the documents. "Isabella Cruz." "Citizenship?" "Not official, but I'm in the process of legalizing my status." Her voice carried no fear, no excuse. Ethan looked up. For the first time, their eyes met. And in that split second, Something inside him, something small, fragile like a wisp of breath, shifted. It was as if her presence reminded him, however faintly, what it meant to be alive, not just functioning. It wasn't because she was beautiful, though she had an oddly magnetic presence. Dark, tied-back hair, sun-kissed skin, and coffee-colored eyes that radiated calm. It wasn't even her posture, upright, composed, as though she were the one conducting the interview. It was because she wasn't afraid. Most people who entered this space shrank in its silence, intimidated by the height, by the silence, by Ethan Blake himself. But not Isabella. She held her gaze steady, not with arrogance, but with honesty. "Do you have experience in housekeeping?" he continued. 7 years, cleaning, cooking, laundry. I've also cared for the elderly, and if needed, I can watch children. Any formal education? I studied early childhood education in Puebla. I had to drop out when my parents died in a factory fire. Her tone held no sadness, just the simplicity of truth. Ethan set the file down. "Why do you want to work here? This place isn't easy. I'm even harder." Isabella smiled slightly, a smile not meant to charm, but as if recalling something warm. "Because I need the job," she said plainly, "and because I believe some places aren't cold because of the temperature, but because no one is there to light the fire." Something in Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't respond. He just looked at her, for a long moment, as though trying to read a language he'd forgotten how to understand. 3 days later, Isabella moved in. She stayed in a small room at the end of the hallway, near the kitchen. She rose early, prepared breakfast, and quietly brought order to things Ethan had stopped noticing. Crooked rugs, wilted flowers, unopened windows. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry about his past, didn't break the silence he wore like armor. Yet somehow she existed in his life, like the first hint of warmth after a winter that had lasted far too long. One evening, as Ethan sat alone staring out at the city lights, Isabella quietly placed a cup of chamomile tea beside him. Not coffee, not whiskey, just warm tea. "You should sleep early," she said, her voice barely above a breeze. Ethan looked at the tea, then at her. Again he said nothing, but this time he reached for the cup. And in that small, silent moment, with no words, no promises, the first crack appeared in the wall. Ethan had never been used to hearing someone else's footsteps in his space. But now he could recognize Isabella's steps from among 100 others. Soft, steady, unhurried, never breaking the silence, almost as if she belonged here long before he realized it. They barely spoke. The first exchanges were brief. "Breakfast is ready. I'll clean the living room today. Do you need anything?" Ethan would nod or give a quick gesture. Strangely, though, he didn't want her to stop. Her silence didn't disturb him. It softened the air, made it easier to breathe. One night, Ethan had a nightmare. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his breathing ragged. The room was dim, lit only by city light bleeding through the window. In the dream, he had seen Claire, her face shattered by a windshield, blood on a wedding dress she never got to wear. He sat upright in bed, chest tight. Then the door quietly creaked open. Isabella didn't say anything. She simply walked in with a glass of water, sat at the edge of the bed, not too close, but close enough to let him know he wasn't alone. "Old nightmare?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded, eyes still locked on some unseen darkness ahead. "I have nightmares too," Isabella said, her voice calm. "Fire, smoke, screaming. Some nights I wake up not remembering where I am. But I learned something. If someone's sitting nearby, it becomes a little easier to breathe." He turned to her. In the faint glow, her face was bare, unguarded, just an honest woman sharing pain. "My parents died in a factory fire when I was 18, she continued. "I dropped out of school, brought my grandmother across the border. We used to sleep in churches, live off leftover food. There were nights I thought I'd never laugh again. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred, as if each word had been drawn from an old wound. But then, she smiled softly, I found my laughter again, in small things. A child's hug, the smell of roasted corn, the sound of someone breathing steadily in their sleep. Ethan didn't respond. He just looked at her, longer than usual. For the first time in years, his pain wasn't private anymore. It was seen. And somehow, that made it lighter. From that night, small conversations began to blossom between them. When she brought him tea at night, when he happened to be in the kitchen while she cooked. They weren't long, they weren't forced, but each word felt like a tiny key, unlocking a hidden door inside Ethan's heart. Isabella never asked about Claire, never dug into the past he had buried deep. But with her gaze, with words soft as breath, she let him know. She saw him, not the cold CEO, not the billionaire, but a man in pain, still trying to survive. And that was something Ethan had never received from anyone, not even from Claire. That night, after Isabella left the bedroom with the empty glass in hand, Ethan remained seated in the dark for a long while. His senses were engulfed in something unfamiliar, not pain, not quite peace either. Just presence, gentle as breath, yet impossible to ignore. He leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. Her words echoed quietly in his mind. If someone's sitting nearby, it becomes a little easier to breathe. How long had it been since he'd felt that? How long since someone had truly stayed when he was at his most vulnerable? No hand to hold, no ear to listen without judgment. Claire had loved him, yes, but they were so young. Their love was beautiful, but not yet deep enough to reach the fears that ran through him. Fears of loss, helplessness, the inability to protect. After her, Ethan closed his doors to the world. People came and went. Everything was conditional. Benefits, alliances, reputation. But Isabella, she had been there, quietly, without demand, without expectations. She didn't try to fix him. She just sat beside him, exactly when he needed it the most. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling a strange ache in his chest, not pain, but something like a lock beginning to turn. A faint glimmer cracked open inside his mind, not defined, not fully formed, but real. And in that wordless moment, Ethan realized, for the first time in 14 years, he didn't feel entirely alone anymore. The feelings between Ethan and Isabella arrived like the beginning of a love song. Slow, quiet, never loud. No one said it out loud. No one tried to name it. But somewhere between the cups of chamomile tea, the glances that lingered longer than necessary, and the evenings that were no longer lonely, something gentle was growing. Ethan wasn't used to someone existing in his space, let alone the feeling of missing that person when she was gone. But these past few days, every time Isabella went back to her room, the apartment felt emptier. Even the silence changed, colder, heavier, more echoing. He didn't call it love, maybe because he was afraid to, or maybe because he didn't believe he was capable of loving again. But some nights, lying alone in the dark, he would wonder, if she left, would he fall back into that endless void again? One April afternoon, with golden light slanting through the floor-to-ceiling glass in the living room, Ethan paused at the kitchen doorway. Isabella was wiping down the wooden table, her hair tied back neatly, a few strands falling against her neck. He watched her in silence, not the way a man watches a woman, but like someone seeing something precious he didn't dare touch. "Isabella," he said. His voice was low but clear. She looked up, a bit startled. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name, his real voice, not filtered through assistants or schedules. "If you're free tonight, would you have dinner with me?" Isabella stood still for a moment. Then her lips slowly curled into a smile. not surprised, not hesitant, just soft, like the first warm breeze of early summer. "Yes," she replied. That night's dinner wasn't a date in the usual sense. No candles, no flowers, no wine. Just tamales, stewed beans, and saffron rice. Meals she'd learned to cook with Abuela Maria. Ethan didn't notice how much he ate, only that, for the first time in years, he didn't feel time passing. The meal didn't feel like a biological routine. It felt alive. After cleaning up, they sat on the balcony, where the wind blew between steel towers and the city glowed with lights below. Ethan spoke about his university days, sleepless nights sketching blueprints, his dream of building a house full of sunlight, a place where no one had to hide in corners to cry. Isabella listened intently. She didn't interrupt with empty praise. She didn't call him a genius, didn't act surprised, but her eyes stayed on him as if every word he said mattered. Ethan felt heard, not because he was a CEO, not because of his losses, but because he was simply himself. For the first time in years, someone wanted to hear Ethan, the man learning to breathe again. That night, as he walked her to her door, she turned and asked, "Why did you choose me, out of so many applicants?" Ethan paused for a moment, then answered plainly, "Because you were the first person who wasn't afraid of me." 2 weeks later, Ethan decided to bring Isabella to meet his mother, Catherine Blake, at a prestigious charity gala. He knew exactly how she might react, but he was done hiding. Not Isabella, not this feeling. The moment Catherine saw Isabella, the expression on her face darkened, just slightly, but enough for Ethan to notice. She scanned Isabella's simple dress, her worn shoes, and makeup-free face with icy precision. "You're serious?" she asked quietly, just enough for the two of them to hear. Ethan didn't respond. He just held Isabella's hand tighter. She tensed for a second, but didn't pull away. Throughout the evening, Catherine barely acknowledged Isabella. When friends asked who she was, Catherine simply called her a temporary assistant. Isabella didn't flinch. She didn't react. Her silence spoke louder than any protest, and Ethan realized her stillness carried more strength than most people's words. 2 days after the gala, Catherine Blake summoned Ethan to the family estate in Lake Forest. The old mansion, where Ethan had grown up, now felt like a distant memory to him. Cold, pristine, always smelling of perfume that was too strong. Catherine sat in the drawing room, holding a glass of white wine. Her gaze was sharp, as if she had rehearsed this confrontation. "You think I'll stand by and let this relationship continue?" she began, wasting no time. Ethan sat across from her, hands resting calmly on his knees, gaze steady. "You don't have the right to choose who I love." "Who is she?" Catherine snapped. "Catherine, a housekeeper? No legal status? No education? No place in society? You're destroying your reputation." "She's the one who made me feel human again," Ethan replied, his voice low but firm. "Not a Forbes name, not a CEO. Do you know the last time someone looked at me and didn't see money in their eyes?" Catherine slammed her wine glass down on the table, the liquid sloshing inside. "You're throwing away everything this family built for a girl with no future?" Senator Whitmore offered his daughter. That alliance could take the company global. "I don't want a political marriage," Ethan answered immediately, "and I don't need you choosing who my heart is allowed to love. One day, you'll regret it, when she leaves, when she breaks you." "Maybe," Ethan said quietly, "but if I don't fight for this chance, I'll regret it every day, for not daring to love again." Catherine was silent. Her expression softened slightly, but her eyes stayed cold. "Then take full responsibility, Ethan. Don't expect my approval." Ethan stood, walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "I don't need your approval. I just need you to understand. I've made my choice, and I'm not going back." That night, Ethan called Isabella. His voice was calm but unwavering. "I don't want to hide you from the world. If you'll allow it, I want you to walk beside me. Seriously." On the other end of the line there was a long pause. Then a soft voice replied, gentle but clear. "Yes, I'll walk with you." After the tense confrontation with his mother, Ethan knew that walking beside Isabella required more than defiance. It required understanding and respect from her world. So, a week later, he made his way to meet the most important woman in Isabella's life. On a Saturday afternoon, Isabella brought Ethan to the small apartment where her grandmother Maria lived. The old building stood in a working-class neighborhood on the city's west side. Peeling walls, drafty hallways, iron stairs that creaked under every step. Ethan wasn't used to places like this. Yet when he stepped into the third-floor unit, small, spotless, filled with the scent of roasted corn and cinnamon, something inside him softened in a way he hadn't expected. Maria was waiting at the table. She wore a simple cotton dress, silver hair tied in a neat bun, sharp eyes behind old glasses. On the table sat a plate of tamales, stewed beans, and 2 glasses of lemonade. "Sit down," she said gently in Spanish, then turned to Isabella. "This one looks better than in the photos, but he looks tired." Ethan smiled, nodded politely. He sat across from her, back straight, hands on his knees like a student facing an exam. They ate together in a warm, quiet rhythm. No tension like the high society dinners he was used to, no silver cutlery or imported wine. Just honest food and the kind of silence that listened more than it judged. When Isabella stepped away to wash the glasses, Maria put down her fork and looked directly at Ethan. "What are you here for?" Ethan looked up, not flinching. "I came to ask for your permission to love Isabella, with care, with seriousness, and with responsibility." Maria didn't answer right away. She studied him, her gaze deep and unreadable, as if she were searching for old wounds behind his polished exterior. Then she gave a small nod and said softly, "That girl has already lost too much. Don't let her lose again." "I won't," Ethan replied. "I can't promise to be perfect, but I'll stay, and I won't let go." When Isabella returned, Maria stood, patted her granddaughter's shoulder, and whispered something in Spanish. Isabella giggled, cheeks flushing pink. Then she turned to Ethan, her eyes brighter than any light he'd ever designed. "I'm going to bed early tonight," Maria announced, walking toward her room. "You two can talk. Just wash your hands after eating tamales." Her bedroom door clicked shut behind her. Ethan and Isabella remained seated, quiet for a moment. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to pause. Ethan took her hand, warm and slightly trembling. "I don't know what the future holds," he whispered. "But if you're willing, I want to start this. With you, no hiding, no distance." Isabella nodded, eyes misty. "I'm ready to be loved the right way." It wasn't a loud confession, but in that moment, they truly became each other's. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of a modest kitchen and the eyes of the woman he loved, Ethan truly believed life had finally given him a second chance. But sometimes, the sky collapses just when you dare to believe in peace again. That morning started like any other, calm, strangely quiet. Isabella was preparing breakfast in the kitchen when the floor-to-ceiling windows began to tremble violently. Seconds later, a voice echoed through the hallway. "FBI, do not move!" Ethan had just stepped out of his office. His expression darkened instantly as a wave of agents in black suits stormed in, weapons drawn, faces unreadable. One agent stepped forward and held out a warrant. "Ethan Blake, you are under arrest for suspected money laundering, tax fraud, and large-scale financial forgery." Isabella froze in place. Ethan turned to her and with just one look said everything. "Stay back." "This is a mistake," Ethan said, his voice eerily calm. "I'll cooperate, but I want my attorney present. We have evidence from bank accounts, shell companies, and forged documentation. Your system has been under surveillance for 8 months." Ethan stared at the agent. The evidence was too perfect, too clean. He knew then someone was behind this. 3 hours later, in a cold interrogation room, Ethan faced the brutal truth. The insider who handed files to the FBI was Darren Miles, his old friend, his business partner, the man he'd once trusted like family. Darren had signed a non-prosecution deal in exchange for implicating Ethan, trading his own secrets for government silence about his connections with Senator Whitmore's office. Ethan clenched his fists so tightly his palms began to bleed. This wasn't just betrayal. It was the collapse of a world he had built with bare hands and blind trust. He hadn't seen it coming, but now it made sense. Darren's recent distance, the strange late-night calls, the mistaken documents. It wasn't suspicion anymore, it was betrayal. That evening, Isabella was allowed to visit him in the holding room. She rushed in, tears streaming down her face, but Ethan remained oddly composed. "You didn't do this," she choked. "I know you didn't. I'll prove it." "You can't," Ethan shook his head. "They have everything. Bank records, emails, even fabricated financial logs. They've built a story, and it's airtight." She grabbed his hands, tears falling onto his cold wrists. "I'm not leaving you." Ethan was silent for a few seconds, then gently pulled his hand away. His eyes met hers, full of love, pain, and finality. "You have to go, Isabella." "No." "Listen to me." His voice dropped, trembling. "If you stay, they'll drag you in. They'll dig into your past, your immigration, Abuela Maria. They'll use you against me." She shook her head, sobbing harder. "You're pushing me away." "No, I'm protecting you." He paused, then whispered, "I can lose everything, but I can't lose you." She looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded, barely. Not because she agreed to leave, but because she understood. Sometimes the only way to stay is to walk away. She stood, hands trembling as they brushed his cheek. One last time. "I'll wait for you," she whispered, "until you come back." Ethan didn't speak, but for the first time in years, his eyes filled with tears. And as the steel door shut behind her, a part of him felt locked away forever. Isabella walked out of the detention center with red eyes, but she didn't look back. She knew Ethan had loved her enough to push her out of the storm. But that same love made it impossible for her to stand still. She didn't run. She chose to fight. Not for Ethan's reputation, not for wealth or status, but for the truth. Because she knew he hadn't done this, and she would be the one to prove it, even if she stood alone. Isabella reached out to Leo Sandoval, a Colombian journalist once threatened with death for exposing a human trafficking ring. Leo was skeptical at first, but after reviewing Ethan's case and the odd gaps in the evidence, he nodded. "You're not just anyone," he said. "You're the woman who's going to bring Whitmore's empire down." With help from a group of volunteers in the immigration network, Isabella began tracing the case in reverse, tracking secret transactions, shady funding documents, and internal memos Darren Miles had signed without board approval. She had once been the woman who mopped the floors. Now she was walking straight into the center of power, and she didn't bow her head. She posed as a job applicant to approach Darren's former assistant, and over the course of weeks, quietly copied hidden files from the system. These documents mapped an entire network of money laundering, policy manipulation, and, most critically, a direct connection between Darren, Senator Whitmore, and a shadow investment fund in the Caribbean. Isabella knew she could be arrested at any moment, but she didn't stop. She had crossed the desert once, slept on cold concrete floors, outran the silence of poverty. She wasn't going to fear the voice of power now. 2 months after Ethan's arrest, Isabella appeared on live television alongside Leo Sandoval, revealing everything. She stood there, not in a designer dress, not giving a grand speech. Just an ordinary woman with fire in her eyes and certainty in her voice. I have no power, but I have the truth. And this truth will not stay buried, not another day. She didn't just save Ethan, she did what no one else dared. She exposed a corrupt empire the world was too afraid to name. After 2 relentless months, sleepless nights, whispered threats, and the constant fear of arrest, Isabella never backed down. She didn't just clear Ethan's name, she pulled him out of the darkness with nothing but her faith, her courage, and a love that never wavered. And now, with justice finally restored, there was only one thing left to wait for: his return. The day Ethan was declared innocent, it rained lightly in Chicago. He walked out of the courthouse in an old shirt, no cameras chasing him, no black cars waiting, no company, no money. But for the first time in his life, he felt something with perfect clarity: freedom. All his life, Ethan had lived for control, numbers, schedules, boundaries. But today, with nothing left to hold on to, he felt something he hadn't in years. He was finally himself. He didn't return to the old penthouse or check into a luxury hotel. He walked through the scent of wet grass and the October chill, and he knew exactly where to find her. The red maple tree by Lake Michigan, the place where, one late summer evening, they once sat together and spoke of sunlit homes, dinners with laughter, and a future free of fear. She was there, waiting. Isabella wore her caramel coat, holding a paper coffee cup that had long gone cold. The wind played with her hair, but she didn't look away. She had seen him from afar, and when he reached her, neither of them said a word. They just looked at each other for a long, quiet moment, as if everything lost had finally found its way home. Ethan sat beside her. They didn't talk about the trial or the company. They spoke of the maple tree, almost bare now, of Lake Michigan, still the same blue, and of the one thing that remained after everything: love. Ethan opened an old backpack and pulled out a small wooden box. No diamonds, no silver shine, just a simple silver ring, once his own, worn back in college, now remade into something new. His hands trembled as he held it out. I have nothing to offer, but I have you in my heart. And if you'll say yes, I want to spend whatever days I have left loving you, quietly, fully. Isabella looked at him. No tears, just a smile, gentle, grateful, and deep enough to say, I've been waiting my whole life for you. Yes, I will. They kissed under the Chicago sunset. No flashing cameras, no audience, just the two of them, one heart finally free, and another that had waited a lifetime to love the right way. Not every ending is loss. Some endings are beginnings. They didn't need to return to the life they once knew. Because in that moment, when Ethan took Isabella's hand under the Chicago sunset, they both understood. The past was closed, and the road ahead would be written by them from the very beginning. Life after the storm didn't return to what it was. But Ethan and Isabella didn't try to go back. They chose to start over with empty hands and hearts full of hope. They no longer had a penthouse or a 7-figure salary. But they had something they never truly had before: time, peace, and a clear sense that they were finally living in alignment with what they believed. With what little they had left and the support of Leo Sandoval and a few donors, they started a charity fund called Home Again to help immigrants, exploited workers, and families starting from nothing. No one should be judged for the place they were born, Isabella said at their small launch event, where simple handshakes meant more than grand speeches. Isabella began teaching English to new immigrants. She wasn't a trained teacher, but each class was filled with laughter because she understood them. She had lived like them. She remembered fearing simple questions at airports and clinics. Ethan visited public schools, teaching design basics and introducing architecture to teenagers with limited access. One boy asked him, "How do you know you picked the right career?" Ethan smiled and replied, "I didn't choose a career. I chose to build hope. The job's just the shovel." They lived in a modest apartment near the park. It wasn't luxurious, but it had sunlight. On the balcony, Isabella grew basil, and Ethan installed a long wooden bench where they could lie down and listen to the rain. But there was something still in their hearts, a dream yet to come true. She wanted a child. So did he. But after an accident years ago, Ethan had been told he was nearly infertile. They hesitated for a long time. Then one evening, Isabella rested her head on his chest and whispered, "What if we try?" Ethan simply squeezed her hand and nodded. They began the IVF process, in vitro fertilization. Doctors warned the chances were low, the costs were high, the emotions exhausting. But they didn't give up. Isabella endured hormone shots every morning, sometimes collapsing from dizziness. Ethan learned how to make ginger porridge, kept medical charts, and covered the walls with sticky notes like a tactical map. Every failed test, they held each other in silence. Every small victory, they held hands a little longer than usual. "Do you believe in miracles?" Isabella asked on a windy night. "I think sometimes the miracle isn't the outcome," Ethan said. "It's having the courage to hope when everything says not to." She nodded, her eyes no longer uncertain. And in that hope, they weren't just rebuilding a life, they were rebuilding a world. After countless failures, weary mornings, and silent nights clinging to each other through tears, they never gave up. And then, on a day that seemed like any other, the miracle arrived quietly. 3 failed attempts, 2 near goodbyes. But finally, on a March morning, the doctor looked at the ultrasound, then turned to them, eyes glowing. Twins. Ethan had just squeezed Isabella's hand, smiling like a child. They hadn't dared to believe it. But this time, the miracle stayed. The labor lasted over 8 hours. When the first cry echoed through the delivery room, Isabella broke down, sobbing. A minute later, the second cry followed. Strong, loud, as if to say, "We've arrived." 2 baby boys. They named them Gabriel and Diego, one name meaning guardian angel, the other symbolizing fierce life. Ethan held the tiny babies in his arms, tears falling freely. He looked at Isabella, the woman who didn't just save him. She gave him something he never thought he'd have, a family. "I used to have everything," Ethan whispered, "but I never had this." "Had what?" Isabella asked, eyes still red. "This feeling, like I'm standing in heaven, with my eyes open." Weeks later, in their small apartment filled with cries and laughter, they learned how to be parents, awkward, exhausted, but never complaining. Ethan changed diapers, washed bottles, and held his sons like he was born for this. Isabella sang lullabies in Spanish, her voice soft as breath. One night, after both babies had fallen asleep, Isabella sat in the wooden chair, holding Diego. Ethan cradled Gabriel beside her. No words, just soft yellow light, 2 steady heartbeats, and eyes that said everything. Ethan leaned down, kissing his son's forehead. "I used to believe I'd end my life in a cold, quiet room," he whispered. But that ending was only a prelude. Because right here, in the sleepless nights and the broken cries, I found the most precious thing in my life, a home. Life isn't always fair, but if we're brave enough to love and patient enough to wait, sometimes miracles don't fall from the sky. They arrive in the arms of ordinary people who love each other in extraordinary ways. And sometimes the most extraordinary love begins with a cup of tea and silence.